This is Join Us in France, episode 333. 333. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we look around France so you can connect to France as a destination. Connect with its culture, history, gastronomy, and everything it takes to have a meaningful experience in France. Today, you can bring out your sword and shield. Elyse and I talk about the Knights Templar, and we hope to bring some clarity to this sulfurous topic. If you like what we do here at Join Us in France, consider supporting us by going to patreon.com/join us and by visiting joinusinfrance.com/boutique, where you'll see purchase links for my cookbook, Join Us at the Table, my self-guided Paris tours, and my favorite books and French products on Amazon. The best way to stay in touch with me and with the podcast is to sign up for the newsletter at joinusinfrance.com/newsletter. And I'll post illustrations of the knights on my Instagram account at Addicted to France. Bonjour Elyse.
Bonjour Annie.
We are talking about the Knights Templar today. How exciting.
Yes, it's exciting. It's exciting because it's something that has a certain, I think in our times, it has a certain sort of romantic, exotic imagery attached to it, movies, books, stories like that. But the reality of it was a little bit different. In fact, I had been thinking the other day that what I was going to say to you is, Annie, you and I are really glad we weren't around in those days. I think so. Really, really not.
Yeah, because the Knight Templars are in everything. They're in movies, in books. There's a lot of lore, around them. So
right.
Let's see if we can make some sense of what, briefly, what happened.
Yes, let's just see. Yeah. I'll just mention very briefly because it has a certain amount of veracity to it, even though it's very, very big production. The movie done by Ridley Scott in 2005 called The Kingdom of Heaven, which of course is a more glorified and prettified version, but based on real people. All the characters in the movie really existed. And it's based on real events. So it's kind of a neat movie to see because it gives you perhaps a far too romantic version of it. But it's kind of neat because it takes you back to those times. And there was an awful lot of fighting. And it wasn't just the fighting between the Muslims and the Christians. It was all these little groups and everybody wanted something, basically. So
yeah.
And the Knights Templar were simply an attribute of what was going on all over Christianity at the time. So maybe let's try and start from what basically is the beginning of this kind of a group. So these were warrior monks is what they were, right? Their official name. They were created officially. They existed actually a little bit before, but the papers that made them exist officially were signed by the Pope in the year 1129. They had already been fighting for about 30 years by then, but this made them official. I'm not sure what difference that made, but there you are. But their official long name was the poor, as in not having any money, which is a laugh and a half when you know the story about them, the poor Knights of Christ and of Solomon's Temple. And that was just too much for anybody to say anyway. So basically it became the Templiers, which in French means the ones from the temple. And that is because their headquarters, when they were created, and they were created in Jerusalem, was the ruins of Solomon's Temple, which is still there and which is they basically took over what has come back to be the Mosque of Al-Aqsa, which is a very big, very beautiful golden domed mosque. But that's where their headquarters were.
So were they French people? Were they from the Middle East?
You asked a wonderful question. They were not French. They were Franks. So This is what we forget, is that even into the 11th and 12th century, the people who came from what we now know as France were known by everyone else in the rest of Europe and in Middle East and North Africa as the Franks, not as the French. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the Muslims, the Arabs, took over Jerusalem and what, of course, is now really Palestine, the Holy Land, however you want to call it. They conquered it and took it over in the year 637. In a space of a year and a half, they went across, literally from basically Iraq, took over everything across all of North Africa up into Spain with an incredible army. And they became the people who were installed in all of what is now Palestine, Israel. But, of course, their headquarters were and stayed Jerusalem. And even though they ran the area, and they really did run it, they did allow Christians to go there because I was under the false impression that during all of the period of time that they were controlling it, that nobody else could go there. But that, in fact, was not true. There were several churches that had stayed open, the Greek and Armenian Orthodox churches. There were several other groups there that are still there. And they had a certain amount of tolerance for people coming as pilgrims to go to the site of where Jesus was born, Jesus was killed, Jesus was buried, and all of that. Until almost 400 years later, in the year 1009. Mm-hmm. And in the year 1009, what happened was that there were 2 or 3 different groups of Arabs that were, one that was basically from the area of Iraq and Syria, the other from Egypt and all of that. They were fighting each other. And the new caliphate that was created was Egyptian. They conquered the area. They fought against other Arabs, other Muslims. And when they took over in 1009, they literally closed it down. And so no longer could Christians come there whatsoever. Oh. And that's the real reason why the Pope decided, and not immediately because it was not really conceived of until almost the end of the same century, but that was really the main motivation for starting what has come to be called the Crusades. And it was simply, they wanted to take back Jerusalem because they were shut out of it, basically. They could not get there anymore. Huh. And so what happened was, and the popes, and we've talked about this before in relation to other things, the popes were all powerful. It wasn't just that they were head of the religion. They were the most powerful politically and the wealthiest of any leaders in all of what was Western Europe at the time, which was certainly not as unified and centralized as it became later on. So the Pope, there were several different ones, but there was a Pope in the middle of the 1000s who decided to try a new idea. Basically, I think that was it. The idea was that he took knights. Basically, he did it the backwards way, or I don't know if it's the backwards way or not, to be honest. He took a group of chevaliers, of knights, and of course this meant that they were a certain amount of nobility involved in this. Mm-hmm. And he basically recruited them as an army for himself, but he wanted them to be loyal and devoted only to defending the religion. So he made them into monks. Mm-hmm. He created a kind of order that existed just for them. And they had to have swear allegiance to the church, to being celibate, and to have a vow of poverty, and the story of
chastity and
and chastity. Right?
Yeah, because they were monks.
Right. So they were monks.
So they were probably like nicer to people than the knight. I mean, a regular knight was a frightful person who could chop your head off.
Well, they weren't nicer. I mean, that was, I mean, basically my conclusion after doing 3 days of research on this is no, they were knights. They were, the monk part was kind of like, we'll put that, we'll add that on. But you'll see what the story is. And basically it kind of got lost in the telling, the whole thing about the monk part. I mean, it's just there were some that were monks first and became knights, but mostly it was the really warriors who, because it was very spiritually, it was attractive to become a defender of the faith, basically. But they were hired and became part of this group to be warriors. And it's rather astonishing. The first time before they were officially named, it was in the middle of the 11th century. The Pope organized a group of them to try and take back what is now southern Italy and Sicily from the Normans, who had invaded and were kings of Sicily for a very long time. In fact, they were also kings of Naples, who, of course, were simply Vikings who had been Christianized and picked up some of the characteristics of the peoples that they were invading, So instead of just being marauders who returned back up to the cold countries up north, they really became the Normans, which of course is how we get Normandy. And the Pope wanted back this territory because it was a question of influence and a question of money. So they created an army. That didn't work. That was in 1053. There was this huge battle. The Pope didn't quite get it right that time, but the idea was germinating, I think, in Rome, the idea that there would be a possibility of creating this group that would have allegiance strictly to them. And so what they did was they went where the people were the most loyal to the Pope and Rome, and that is to what we now call France. And all of the different little territories that were all separate at the time, Anjou, Aquitaine,
right.
Toulouse. These were all separate little kingdoms, and they were all with their hierarchy of their counts and their dukes and their knights and everything else. There's a wonderful, magnificent painted mural in the city hall here in Toulouse of a real event, and that is the day that the Pope Urban II arrived in Toulouse in the year 1095. And he came with a huge entourage. The painting is wonderful. I absolutely love it. It's enormous. He came to Toulouse because he wanted to get the Count of Toulouse at the time, who was Raymond V, to pledge to go with him on what would become the First Crusade. And the First Crusade took place in the year 1099. And the reason for the Crusade was to take back the Holy Land from the Muslims who had invaded and who occupied the whole territory and who were not allowing Christians there anymore. And so the Count of Toulouse did go. The counts and the dukes and the barons of just about everywhere in the Frankish kingdoms went there. And in fact, when they did get there, this was the most successful of all the 9 Crusades, the very first one. They arrived in Jerusalem in 1099. Apparently, they were extremely well organized. They had a huge army, and they actually probably took the occupying forces by surprise, because they were able to take Jerusalem. And Jerusalem became known as the Frankish Kingdom of Jerusalem, which I didn't know either.
Huh. And so how long did they keep that Frankish Kingdom of Jerusalem?
They kept the Frankish Kingdom of Jerusalem lasted almost 200 years.
Oh, that's a long time.
It lasted. Yeah, except that in the course of the 200 years, it actually, the official beginning was 1099 when they took it over, and the official ending of it was 1291 when they lost their last battle, and that was the official ninth crusade, because in fact there were zillions of little mini crusades in between, and that was when they lost the city of Acre, which is still a fortified city north of the city of Haifa. So it's on the coast right before you get to the northern frontier of Israel. It's I have to say, having been there, it's really quite an amazing thing to go there. But once that city was lost, Jerusalem was lost, and so was the rest of the Holy Land, for the simple reason that that was where all the ships landed and everything took off from. And so once they lost it, that was the end of that, and that was the end of that. But in the meantime, what happened was that this group that was created by the Pope, called the Knights Templar, let's just use them, but the common terminology that everyone uses. In the meantime, their original mission had been just to be in the Holy Land, to protect people who came there, to escort the royalty. And then what happened was, little by little, they developed into what turns out to be this incredible corporation, and I'm using that in the sense of the modern sense of the term corporation, with outlets everywhere along the way, from going back west, from the Holy Land all the way, every country in Europe, all the way up through and into England. Wow. And there was not a country that did not have a base or many bases and outlets that were connected to the Knights Templar. And the reason why, and this is where it comes into the romantic stories, because a lot of stuff was written about them much later on, like in the 1700s and the 1800s and the 1900s, where there's this very kind of romantic vision of this, these knights. If you read the translations of what some of the Arabs who interacted with them say, you have a very different opinion of them, because apparently, among other things, they were supposed to shave their heads, but they never washed.
Oh,
so yeah, so and of course Muslims wash a lot, and they're very clean. It was like they were absolutely repulsed by some of these warrior monks, because they were pretty barbaric as far as they were concerned. You could
smell them before you could see them.
Exactly. That was part of the problem. You could smell them before you could see them. It was just probably in the end how they got lost. They just. But this is what happened. It was that in the papers that were established, that were written up by the Pope, it's very interesting because, of course, part of the problem with this time in history in Western Europe is that for anybody to be able to defend the Christian religion was considered an honor. So we know that the people who worked on building cathedrals, it was an honor. So, because you can wonder, why would they even want to do this? Because the setup was this. They had to be self-sustaining. They had to actually make their own money. They weren't given a penny by the Pope. They weren't given a salary. They were told that they had to figure out how to make money themselves. So, two of the things they did, and they became very good at it, was that they established forts, or what they came to be called commanderies, building them all along the way across all of Europe, because as pilgrims were now encouraged to go to the Holy Land, and they walked 12,000 kilometers to get to the Holy Land, except for the little time that they were on a ship. And the ships left either from basically places we know about, Aigues-Mortes, Marseille, Nice, or or Genoa, a couple of other places like that, and Brindisi, which is on the heel of the boot of Italy. But otherwise, they had to walk. And of course, people who were pilgrims were either poor or rich. And whatever they were, they had to worry about being having their being robbed. Thank you. Having their stuff stolen and things like that. So what happened was that little by little, the Knights Templar basically came up with a concept, and it really is very interesting. They came up with a concept that became the notion of exchange, of a money exchange. And what they would do is they would take at the different places along the way, they would have deposits made by whoever it was that was a pilgrim, and the money was kept. And in exchange, when they got to the end, when they finally got to the Holy Land, they would be given back the equivalent in the local currency. And one of the reasons that this was very interesting is because they were technically not allowed to charge interest. There were bankers, yes, the Lombardy bankers, and of course the Jews were the ones who were the two groups that were allowed to be bankers charging interest, but they were technically not allowed to charge interest. But they did charge interest, because what they did was, as soon as a person arrived in Jerusalem, or going back the other way, when they did the money exchange, because they had the equivalent of what would be a coupon saying, this is how much I put in and this is how much I get back, what would happen is that the Knights Templar always made sure that the exchange was to their advantage.
Well, sure, yeah. Very interesting.
So they made a lot of money. They even did something that I could not have guessed they did. They had enough money to build their own fleet of boats. And what they did then was they used the boats for the transporting of pilgrims, but when they weren't transporting the pilgrims, because the pilgrims left in the spring and in the autumn, and they stopped for the winter, usually southern Italy, they rented out, they had a real big business sense. They rented out the boats to anybody who wanted to do any kind of shipping of merchandise on the Mediterranean, and therefore they made a lot of money from the boats that they built.
So if I understand you correctly, so you would, like, if you wanted to move money, you could give some money to a Knights Templar in Paris, say.
Yes.
And instead of, it's not the actual money that moved, it's like some sort of letter saying, right, this person is owed this amount of money. And when they got to the other side, they redeemed. Okay, I get it.
Yes. And then what would happen is, because they wanted to make sure that the pilgrims were safe, because the first few years, the Knights Templar really were only in the Holy Land. And then over the course of a certain couple of generations, they expanded west, going all the way, of course, really as far as building things, even as far as north as Scotland. And so what they did was, with the money that they were making, they built for either fortifications, or they built what are called commanderies, which are like a huge farm. In my mind, it's kind of like a hacienda. There was a part that was church. There was a part for the local Knights Templar to sleep in. But the rest of it was a place for the pilgrims to stay, for the pilgrims to eat. And also, it was where they produced goods. And so the pilgrims, once they had this exchanged paper, they never had to shell out $1, basically. They never had to shell out any money. They would always stop at a safe house, one of these commanderies or fortresses, where everything was taken care of. Okay. And so that way they didn't have to worry about being robbed.
Right. They weren't moving money, per se. They were moving a letter that gave them
they were moving
the right
and apparently, right, this was the beginning of a concept of basically our notion of a check. Let's face it, this is it, right?
Yeah.
Because this was the check. This was what they did. So this is basically what happened, was that over a period of time, they became very, very influential. What happened was, though, at the same time that they became so influential, they started to have rivalry with the Knights of the Jerusalem, what are called the Hospitaliers.
Ah, yes. Hospitaliers were more like the medical helpful
Right.
monks.
Right, they were more helpful, but they turned out to become they over a period of time became rivals, and because the Hospitalier, they also were receiving money, but they were receiving money more from the nobles and from the royals, so that they could help take care of the sick, the lepers, the people who were wounded in battle.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a huge rivalry between the two, because at some point, one of the popes actually told the Knights Templar, you have to help them too. And they didn't really want to.
Oh,
They
I see.
just, it was like, nah, we let them take care of themselves. I think it was a little bit, that kind of a thing,
It's such a different world. Like, nothing works like that anymore. It's so bizarre.
Well, yeah, it is bizarre. But and then the other thing they did, and this is where it gets to when we talked about Aigues-Mortes and Saint Louis, which of course is actually the seventh Crusade. But they became so wealthy that they were able to buy very important relics. And they also financed some of the expeditions of the various Frankish or French kings, so that when Louis IX, when he finally manages to acquire the crown and all of the relics that he brings back to Paris, it's because the king of Jerusalem, and these are all, of course, you have to, everybody was cousins with everybody, okay? They were all, oh my God, they were so related that it's just absolutely unbelievable. And in fact, you just kind of get dizzy reading about all these intermarriages and connections and everything. But what happened was that the king of Jerusalem at the time, he'd gotten himself into debt with the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar had taken over all of these relics, and they are the ones that sold them to St. Louis.
I see. Okay.
So it was one of these, like, okay, you want these? We want money. Here we go. Okay. Of course, I've been reading so much about them the last few days. It's like, I think, I don't know if I'd ever want to really meet one in real life at this point. They were just a little bit too crazy funky for me. Anyway, they expanded. They became extraordinarily wealthy, and there was a certain pushback because of that. They had and still have, and if you go on to any, there are several internet sites where you can see the number of fortresses and commanderies that belong to the Templars that still exist in all of Western Europe. It is absolutely mind-boggling, absolutely mind-boggling. There are some gorgeous ones, and there's one not very far from us in the Aveyron, up in the right near Roquefort. That's absolutely beautiful to see. They're all over England. There are a whole bunch of them in Germany. In Spain, they tended to build fortified castles more. I don't know why. I don't know whether it's because the land was not fertile enough for them to use it or not. Because what they did on top of everything else, because that's why they were more than just being warriors. They became this incredible corporative kind of organization. In Normandy, they invested in cows so that they could produce milk and leather to sell. In the Champagne area, they had a commandery that produced wine. In the south, they produced cheese. Every area that they built one of these places, they produced whatever was a good thing to produce locally, and they made a lot of money that way. So they generated a huge amount of money. And the one that is there is one in the region of the town of Meaux, which of course is where the brie is made, right? And no, not Normandy, the east of Paris, and Meaux is like north of Champagne area, right? Just a little bit. That is still the the commandery that is the best preserved, that you can actually go and visit. It's all the buildings are still there. The one in the south here in Avignon is kind of neat, but it's been turned into a bit too much of a kind of Disney World attraction, because there are like these little artisan shops and things like that there too. But you can see the size of it and the power that they had. And of course, there was a certain amount of infighting. And then, of course, what they're famous for, almost ironically, is their downfall.
Right.
This is weird, right? I mean, this is what's weird, you know. So what happens is there are technically 9 official crusades, but I was online reading about a bunch of this stuff yesterday, and one of the articles was saying was that, yeah, officially there were 9, but in between there were all kinds of attempts to take back territory they were losing, because in the course of those 200 years, some of the land was taken back by the Muslims. Some of it was given back to the Christians. They were constantly fighting. It wasn't peaceful at all. They were, and there were even times when, because one caliphate was fighting another caliphate, some of them aligned with the Christians against each other. I mean, in that way, the movie The Kingdom of Heaven is actually pretty good, because it really shows you how nuts they all were. I mean, basically, you know, they were all fighting all the time. I mean, you know, basically fighting all the time. And then what happened is they were starting to be resented by even Rome, because of their power, because of their riches, which were dispersed, across an enormous territory from one end of Europe to the other. But by the time we get to the Ninth Crusade, they lose. It wasn't just them that were fighting. Obviously, there were lots of other nobility and soldiers that were brought from Europe to try and fight, because a man named Saladin had taken back Jerusalem. He was a brilliant warrior, and this was an attempt to take back everything. And Acre, the city of Acre, was a key to everything in that part of the world. And in 1291, the Battle of Acre was fought, and the Christians lost, basically. They were kicked out. And what we have here is 200 years of a dynasty of what was originally Frankish or French nobility that has stayed there and has produced, generations of more of the same group of people. And so everybody was literally kicked out. They had to go home. I mean, home for them, you're among other people, the kind of person who would understand what that means when you say to somebody who's been living in a place for 200 years, this ain't your home, go away, that kind of thing. Right? Exactly. Yeah. So in 1291, the Holy Land officially went back into the hands of the Muslims. And the Pope, who had started to feel as though the Knights Templar were getting really too big for their britches and were really too rich, and they were causing a problem, because what do you do with basically 200 years of these men who have done nothing but fight and make money? I mean, that's all they've ever done, is fight and make money. And the king is this king called Philip the Bel, Philip the handsome one, who was actually the fourth Philip. And he wants to get rid of them as well, because he wants to take back control over a lot of the territories that they have controlled. They own so much land in France, among other countries. He doesn't want them to have all of that land anymore.
Right.
So what happens is, it was powerful. And so it turns out that the Pope at the time had to negotiate with the King of France, because Philip the Bel wanted to make the king the most powerful person in France. And the Pope, and I can't remember, I actually don't remember which Pope it is, because there were so many, but the Pope he wanted to make sure that the king understood that, no, the Pope, was the most powerful person. So a war of words and of documents and of legal issues developed between the French king and the Pope. And Philip the Bell basically announced, and here it is, I have it written down finally, he's Bonifacio the Eighth, okay? Philip the Bell basically writes to him and says to him, I'm dissolving the Knights Templar. I don't want them here anymore. You do what you want. I don't want them here. And the Pope says, basically, there's this basically a combination of philosophical and political and religious argument that goes on for a couple of years between the two of them. And the Pope sends out all of these notices. They're called the bulle. It's the official notice of the Pope when he wants something official documented, saying basically, don't you touch them. They're mine. They're not yours. They're mine. They're not under your order. They're under my order. And Philip the Bell basically defies the Pope. And what he does, it sounds, now this is where it really is like one of these modern movies. It really got me excited reading about this. I'm really an idiot. I know. Let me just say this, He's very, very clever. And he decides that the only way he's going to do what he wants to do, which is basically strip them of all of their possessions and of all of their power, is if he manages to arrest them all by surprise.
Right.
That is, he's not going to do just the ones who are in their headquarters in Paris, which is why, by the way, in the Marais, we have the Rue du Temple, because that's where their headquarters were.
Yeah.
The Templiers were there. But, so he sends out the king in September of 1312. He sends out his troops everywhere in the country, absolutely everywhere. And at exactly the same moment, on exactly the same day, they go to every fortress and every commandery where there are Templars, and there are, at this point, probably thousands, because they're everywhere, and they are all arrested at the same exact time. Now, this is not the days of internet, obviously. It would have taken a certain amount of days for the news to go from one place to another. But imagine that by horseback, you can get the news going from Paris to a lot of other places very, very quickly. He wanted them to be taken by surprise, and literally that is exactly what happened.
That was probably the only way he could figure to get them, because if you do it slowly, they have time to regroup and fight back.
They would fight back, and of course these were experienced fighters. These were warriors. These were killers. I mean, these were people who were basically like killing machines, I mean, in the service of God. I mean, that's really what they were. So what happens is that there's this enormous big to-do between him and the Pope, and there are some negotiations that go on, but Philip the Bell was determined to get rid of them one way or the other. And so what happens is he orders Jacques de Molay and one other person, who are the two masters of the Templars. There were four of them that were arrested in Paris, and they're put in prison. And in the meantime, they put soldiers everywhere, and they arrest all of these Templar, and little by little, they basically insist that they have to confess to their sins. They get like in the Inquisition, except that it's the king doing it. It's not the Pope doing it. They have to confess to all of their terrible sins. And if they confess, because they were accused of things like sodomy, things that basically are outside the realm of just whether you believe in God or not. They were really getting accused of all kinds of scandalous things. They were told that if they confessed, that they would be saved and put in prison. And if they didn't confess, that would mean they were guilty, which is very much like the Inquisition worked. And then they would be put to death. And at one of the places in Normandy, he took 138 of the Templars, and he basically in one day had them all executed.
Wow.
One after the other. Right.
That. And Jacques de Molay was burned on the Ile de la Cité.
He was burned on the Ile de la Cité. So this is what happens with them. But this is what's fascinating, because apparently in 2002, a bunch of documents were found that prove that the the end of the Knights Templar was not the fault of the Pope, but of the king, because there's been a lot of dispute over the last few centuries about who was really responsible for it. And it turns out that the Pope, in an effort to try and save them, he offered to have them given a dispensation by a certain religious dispensation. I really wouldn't probably understand exactly what it meant, but that their souls would be saved and therefore their lives could be saved if they agreed to certain conditions. And some of them could go back to even civilian life. And they told the four masters, of course, Jacques de Molay is the one that everyone basically knows the most, that they could do this as well. So at first they all confessed, because if you confessed, you could have your life saved. Mm-hmm. And then it turns out, I don't know what happened, but maybe out of pride, I don't know. Molay was already in his late 60s at this point. He was not a young man anyway. But Jacques de Molay and one other of the four leaders, at the moment when they were being they were placed in front of the king and could have saved their lives that way, they out loud, they said, no, we were lying. We didn't. Basically, they went back on their confession. And by going back on their confession, the king was able. It's very complicated, isn't it? The king was able to say that they had to be burned at the stake because basically it meant that they were liars. It's kind of weird stuff, I know, but basically what happened. So
he
Jacques
wanted
de
to
Molay,
kill them anyway. I mean, that was
he wanted them dead.
Yeah,
he wanted them dead. Yeah. So
that was the whole
they
plan.
were burned. They were burned, and of course, the two things. One is that there were contemporaries who witnessed their being burned alive. And it was at the time called the Île des Juifs. It's now Île de la Cité. There were two people who were noblemen who witnessed their executions, who said that they died with absolute dignity and never made a sound. They turned their heads towards the Cathedral of Notre Dame and very dignified way actually allowed themselves to be burned to death. But Jacques de Molay, and this of course is where you get all the legends and the books and everything that are written afterwards, he said, you and your family and all of those connected to you will be cursed for 13 generations.
Yes. Right.
And that was the end of Molay, and that was the end of the Knights Templar. And strangely enough, I thought, I don't know about you, but I thought they had all been killed. That wasn't true. It was basically just the big shots that were killed. A lot of them were allowed to go back to just a normal civilian life and went off to become farmers and people like that again. But the money, the treasury, and all their possessions was taken by the king, Philippe the Bel, which meant, of course, that the Pope and Rome would not get it. And he gave control of most of their property and some of their money to the Knights of the Hospitalier. Mm-hmm. And here in Toulouse, there's still an office for the Knights of the Hospitalier. Did you know that?
I did not know that. Where is it?
It's right near the Church of the Dalbad. Right behind the...
I must have walked there a million times because I used to go to the Dalbad as a kid.
But I don't know. There's a big plaque outside that tells you that that's what's there. And they of course still exist. They still exist here. They still exist in Jerusalem. They never got dissolved. They must have been good boys. I don't know what they did to not get dissolved.
Yes, and if you listen to Dan Brown, they are involved in all sorts of conspiracies, right?
They're in, yes. Well, I mean, maybe it may be too. But if anybody, when they come to France, wants to visit one, they're fascinating. And the three that are in the best condition are the one that is in Coulommiers, which then is like east of Paris. There's one in Normandy that's very beautiful, and the one that's in Aveyron, which is also very beautiful. But they're all over, and a lot of them, of course, are now historical monuments. I don't know. I think many of them are in ruins. but it's fascinating to see. And it's also amazing to realize that for the period that they were in existence for 200 years, they were the biggest, richest corporation ever.
Mm-hmm. And to find those places to visit today, you just search for Commanderie Templier and the
Yes.
and the area, near me or with the zip code of the place where you are. And, let me see if I do that for where I am. Commanderie Templier with my zip code. It sends me to the Coulommiers, which is far away.
Well, it's far away. No, but the closest one for us, actually, that's really visitable and it's really neat is the Aveyron.
Aveyron, yeah.
Is Aveyron. But there are others. And, some of them are not in great condition. But these are the three that are really where you can see the structure. You can see how they lived at the time, what they did. But they're all over. I mean, there are vestiges. And they're all over England, too, which I didn't know.
And, of course, they're all recognizable with the emblazoned red cross on their chest.
Exactly. Exactly. And, of course, the cross, of course, because they're supposed to be serving God, right?
Yeah.
And the red because they're fighting.
Yeah, blood.
Yeah, the red for their fight. They're actually fighting. And, of course, the term crusade is very easy. It's pretty obvious, but when you don't think about it, it doesn't make any difference, which is comes from the word croisé, which means cross.
Right.
And it was basically the fighting in the name of the cross.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I think it would make for a really interesting visit. It's worth asking wherever you happen to be in France. It's worth asking if there is a commanderie or if the local tourist office tells you that there's a commanderie you can go look at. It's probably worth it because this is
sure.
Yeah, they were everywhere in France. So some of them are going to be small, some of them are going to be big, but yeah.
They were everywhere. Remember when we talked about La Rochelle, they used La Rochelle to get their wine. They picked up their wine there, and they were at the Aigues Mortes because they had a base there because that was one of the places they left from. They had basically bases pretty much everywhere, and some of it was purely for agricultural purposes to produce things that were, goods that they could trade for money, and then places that were like that were because of the ships, because they were coming in and out, and things like that. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know the history of any of them personally, except for what we can read about Jacques de Molay, for instance. There were several of them, and one of them actually really did exist, who's in this movie Kingdom of Heaven. There were several who were knights that were noblemen who participated as Knights Templar for a few years and then left left the order. And I don't know, honestly, I didn't read anything about it to know if that was something that happened a lot or not. Did they just get fed up with this and decide that they just wanted to go home, and wherever it was, that was home? Not too many of them lived to be very old. Let's face it. Wow. The fighting that the kind of fighting that they were doing, didn't have too much of a chance of surviving after the first. It's kind of like a gladiator. I mean, after the first 2 or 3 battles,
Yeah.
Those who managed to survive really deserved a nice retirement, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I'm just looking at one more term that you might want to do to find them. It's often called Maison du Temple. So Maison for house and du Temple, and then wherever you are. Yeah, there's a bunch of them. I mean, if you start digging around, you'll find some.
And I have to say, I must confess that as much as I think I know a lot about Paris, I've always thought, until doing all this research, that the Rue du Temple in the 4th was because of a Protestant temple. I hadn't realized it was because of the Knights Templar.
Yeah.
And
they had a lot of land around in that area. Yeah, and
they had a lot of land.
I mentioned it in my Paris tours, my voice map Paris tours. The one for Ile de la Cité will take you right where Jacques de Molay was killed, and I mentioned them in the Marais tour as well. So it's kind of interesting to see the places where
it of course, I mean, this bit about the curse that Jacques de Molay said there. There's a French writer who wrote a series of books called Les Rois Maudits.
Les Rois Maudits, yeah. And that's where it comes from, I think, that
Right.
that curse. As far as I know, we don't know if it really happened. But it's true that once he cursed them, both the Pope and the King were dead within a couple of years.
Yep.
So maybe the curse worked. Who knows?
Maybe. It's kind of like opening up a tomb with a mummy in it. You never know.
You never know.
You just better be careful. Wear your insulated protective suit when you're going to go and do something like that. You just never know. But it is true. I mean, for once, we're not really talking about a specific place or anything but they are so important in the history of France of that 200-year period,
Of the Middle Ages, yeah.
Of the Middle Ages. They just, they're connected to just about everything in one way or the other.
Well, thank you so much, Elyse. That was very interesting, and I hope our listeners get a chance to visit some commanderie or Maison du Temple or something like that when next time they're able to come to France.
Yes, and hopefully that will be soon, that we can all do things like that.
Let us hope. Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Again, I want to thank my patrons for supporting the show and giving back. Patrons get several exclusive rewards for doing so. You can see them at patreon.com/join us, Patreon. Join us, no spaces or dashes. Thank you all for supporting the show. Some of you for a long time. You are wonderful. And a shout out this week to new patron, Patrick Rowe. Thank you so much for becoming a patron and making this podcast possible. Today I published a video of the French countryside on my way to a charming village in the Dordogne. Patrons and donors log in to addictedtofrance.com to see it. It's dreamy and peaceful, and I found some a great track of music I had recorded on the street to go along with it. Bonjour, Elyse. How is your Patreon going?
Oh, well, thank you for asking me, Annie. My Patreon is going along slowly and steadily. I guess we can say it that way. I would like to give a shout out to 3 new patrons, and I just would like to say once more, I cannot thank you all enough for supporting me, for being one of my patrons, for giving me motivation and energy to keep on going. So this time I would like to thank Carol and Leslie and Bet. Thank you so very, very much, all 3 of you. And just for all of my patrons out there, and for those of you who maybe are not yet a patron, you should know that the next episode coming up is going to be partly about those wonderful little fruit we called strawberries.
Les fraises.
Les fraises. Except that the letter is G. So there's the puzzle that we're going to talk about.
Okay. Thank you, Elyse.
You're welcome.
And to support Elyse on Patreon, go to patreon.com/ElyseArt. ELYSART. This week, I've also done several itinerary consults. While this isn't the time to come back to France yet, it is definitely the time to solidify your plans for your next trip to France. And this is not a free service, but it's pretty good because I talk to you and I get to know you personally. Then I can recommend an itinerary that will fit you like a glove. Email Annie@joinusinfrance.com to set that up. For my personal update this week, it's been a busy and yet kind of boring, not fun week. April 15th was upsetting because it was the second anniversary of Notre Dame burning, and it's coming back. It's made some great progress. I shared some videos on Facebook and on the Addicted to France forum. But, that was upsetting. And also we went over 100,000 deaths by COVID-19 in France. And we're not out of the woods yet. And that's probably the most upsetting of all. But, the numbers are going in the right direction. We've just gone over 18% of the French population who has received one dose of the vaccine, including Patricia, my friend in Paris. Yay! It's getting a little bit easier to make an appointment for a vaccine for people over 60 anyway. But we need to open up for younger folks, whether or not they have comorbidities. We'll get there, but it's going to be slow. And I still can't tell you when you can come back to France. At the rate we're going, it's going to be slow but steady, But there's some talk of opening up a few things in the next couple of weeks for people who live in France. Remember, we're still under severe restrictions here in France. I cannot go more than 10 kilometers away from my house without risking getting in trouble with the police. Of course, I'm lucky because there is zero enforcement of this rule where I live, at least not during the daytime. But nothing is open. So what would be the point of going places? Everything's closed. So we just have to wait for this disease to stop spreading so much, and then we can get back to normal. Now, the bright spot of the week is that yesterday I had a Zoom call with volunteers who are now moderators of the Join Us in France closed group on Facebook. Chris, Shannon, Graydon, Debbie, Ernesto, Jennifer, Bev, and Dolores, thank you so much. I'll talk to a couple more next week. So we'll have a full team keeping an eye on the group, and we'll be ready for when travel opens again. The purpose of the group is just like the purpose of the podcast: share what we love about France, talk about the destinations and activities we enjoyed, share tips and personal experiences, but also to keep it real and tell people of the difficulties that they might run into, especially if they are uninformed about how things go in France, how things run in France. The thing is, there are a lot of people on Facebook who do not listen to this podcast because they don't know it exists or because they're not into the habit of listening to podcasts. Having them in the group is a great opportunity to let them know about the podcast as a resource, and that it's a great way to learn about France without even trying, really. A couple of years ago, because it was so hard to keep up with the group, I decided that only podcast listeners should be allowed in. But now that I have so many wonderful helpers, we've, as a group, decided to change it back to anyone who is interested in France. Of course, we're not going to let spammers in, and we'll do due diligence to keep marketers and self-promoters at bay. And if you see stuff like that, I would appreciate if you would report it, because it helps us see it. But we'll allow more people who are just casually interested in the group. And maybe they'll start listening to the podcast, and maybe they won't. That's, their loss, I guess. So feel free to invite your friends to join the group, even if they don't listen to the podcast. But we all have one or two creepy friends. So keep them away, please. When the group gets active again, it would be great if you could use podcast episodes when answering questions. And if you don't remember what podcast episode it was that you heard about this or that, just point them to the front page, joinusinfrance.com, and let them search for it. I try to keep all the information on the podcast categorized properly, so it's easy to find. But after 333 episodes, I mean, obviously there's a lot that can get buried, I guess. When the group gets active again, I predict that there will be a lot of questions about when can I travel to France again, and it's really a tough question to answer. My answer is we're getting closer to this every day. I don't know the exact date yet. That's the best I can do for them. Next week, I'll continue working on my garden. I think I'll take a chance and plant the tomatoes early in one of these wonderful things called a wall of water. I brought them back from the US and I never used them here, but I think this year I'm going to use them and see if they help. I've got most of the pots on my terrace planted. I have this... I love to have lots of flowers on my terrace. And now it's on to the vegetable garden. I'm still ripping out a long, skinny strip of glass to replace it with vegetables and flowers, because I have a small garden, and so why have so much grass, But ripping out grass is hard work. But I'm stubborn, and I will keep pecking at it. A little bit every day. Just, a couple of feet every day. Fields of rapeseed are turning bright yellow in France. Rapeseed is the plant that they use to make canola oil. And we have several fields of that around where I live. So I think I'll get on my bike and ride by a few of those fields next week and turn on my little action camera. Let's see if I can take some nice shots to share with my patrons and donors. Show notes for this episode are on joinusinfrance.com/333, where you can see a recap of what we've discussed, as well as links to relevant resources. And if you enjoy the show, introduce a friend to the podcast and show them how to listen, maybe on Facebook. We're everywhere: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, Pandora, and you can even ask your smart speaker to play Join Us in France. And of course, you can listen on joinusinfrance.com as well. Next week on the podcast, a fun episode. Well, to me, it was a lot of fun to record. I'm naming it You Might Be a Francophile. So I quizzed Elyse on her Francophileness. Francophility? No. Is she a good enough Francophile? Was the real question. And I think you might ask yourself that same question. Anyway, that'll be next Sunday on the podcast. Send questions or feedback to Annie@joinusinfrance.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you join me next time so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France travel podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2021 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.